One of the biggest blocks we can face on a path of self-actualization are fears of judgment and criticism. So I invite you to make a list right now of things that you haven't yet done or things that you chose not to do because you wanted to avoid some type of real or perceived criticism. Whether this is based on past actual criticisms or imagined and anticipated ones, these are some of the most powerful inhibitors of the positive actions that we want and need to take because they activate core networks of shame and social belonging, as well as anger in cases of overt ostracization or repeated forms of exclusion. So these fears also tap into innate intuitions we have about what's just and unjust. And on top of that, these fearful anticipations of criticism feed into feelings of imposter syndrome, which I just made a video on that you should check out, as well as encouraging perfectionist tendencies as a strategy, again, for hoping to avoid negative judgment. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how deeply damaging these fears are and how pervasive the social conditions are which cause them to flourish, really like cancerous cells or an autoimmune disorder. And then I'm going to talk about how we can begin to get some of our power and energy back from something that really does work, like a psychological virus or parasite. So if you're new here, welcome to the channel. My name is Shannon, and I'm making these videos in part to help people, especially other gifted and creative empaths, on a path of authenticity and life purpose coaching. So, and this is basically all just goes back to helping you stand in your own alignment and remain in alignment. And so to learn more, you can check out some of my other videos, and there's also going to be some links below where you can sign up for updates. Okay, so let's go back to that list that I suggested you write of all the things that you were hesitating on or things that you haven't yet done because you were trying to avoid what someone might say or do or think. Now let's make a second list of some actual judgments and criticisms you've received in the past. And overt insults would also fall into this category. Now, we're not doing this to purposefully like just dig up bad memories, but I just want you to learn to take like an objective, like detached look at some of these like all together, and to really mobilize like a sense of anger, really, how like nasty and judgmental some of these are. So if you saw someone saying these things to a close friend or to a young child, I mean, I'm assuming you would feel some type of apprehension about the injustice, about the asymmetry of power happening here. And, you know, you would have an innate sense that this is wrong to speak to somebody in that way. So a quick caveat, of course, I'm mostly not talking about genuine and sensitive forms of helpful feedback. And you know the difference because someone who's mastered that skill, you will still feel lifted up. You will feel the benefit. It will not be an egoic dynamic that somehow, in a backhanded way, tries to like make you feel worse about yourself, which is the way that the majority of these actually work. And yeah, they're just bringing you down in a way that's supporting their own egoic perspective or their own egoic platform. Okay, and so now once you have these two lists, I want you to compare these and draw out any obvious links between the past criticisms and judgments and your not taking action on something today. So, or maybe you're delaying your action because of what you feel someone might say or even what they might think. And this affects you because this is what it means to be extra sensitive. It's not a weakness. It's actually an additive property. So you can pause this video if you need to, if you want to take a minute, and then I'm going to share a few of mine. Okay, So there's no shame in this. This is an eye-opening exercise, and you're ultimately going to be the one flexing after this once you learn that it's safe to actually move ahead and do the thing that your higher self is calling you to do when you have cognitive strategies for basically sidestepping or averting these kind of like trigger response anticipatory fears. Okay, so here's my list. I'm just keeping it super short and simple for this. But some things that I've delayed or just haven't done yet. For example, I really delayed starting this channel. I had the idea for doing this probably at least a couple of years before I actually started on it for various types of resistance that I was working through. And another one is that I haven't published my poetry or my book yet. And I could have done this. Again, working through some different forms of anticipated criticism. Not what you might expect, but just conflicting forms of resistance. And maybe the worst or dramatic here is that I was accepted to present a paper at a major conference in Brazil, and ultimately, partly subconsciously, but I kind of sabotaged this on myself because I was inadvertently trying to avoid a certain criticism that I was anticipating from doing that. Now, these are all things that you could easily see someone really dropping into like self-judgment or shame or fears of failure because of this. But once you can see it through the lens of the anticipated criticisms and judgments that someone's trying to avoid, it makes a lot more sense. And so, just to share a few actual judgmental statements that I've received, most of which were actually just false. That is also very common. These are projections. So I've heard, you never finish anything you start, which is false. Or, you're not prioritizing what you should be prioritizing. Or general vague comments about something still needing more work before it's really good enough for public consumption. And another really good one I'll always remember from a rather elitist instructor who told me that like a final project that I was working on really showed that I didn't put any effort into it, which is really rich because I went through like all these extra tutorials. I had to take twice as long as everyone else. I gave up like all my free time for 2 weeks to meet the requirements of it, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so it was just like extremely insulting. It was quite snobbish and privileged on her part, and rather unproductive too, when you think about it from the perspective of education. So you can see how these kinds of judgments would combine and mix together in a kind of like mental soup that would really cause someone to like delay publishing their own book, for example. Like think of the conflicting kinds of messaging here. And I'm sharing this so that you can see a bit of a model and do this yourself with your own two lists and find these conflicting messages. For example, better take more time and spend more effort so that it's good enough. But also, you better not work on it instead of like the activities that you should be prioritizing. For example, like just collecting a paycheck. And, these both conflict in turn with judgments like, you never finish anything you start. See? Now, the point here is definitely not to just bring in another criticism and think something like, oh, you're too sensitive. No, that's not the problem. The problem is that our social and cultural norms are completely insensitive, as I've discussed in like my first two videos on the Matrix, have a really good explanation of this. So for you, what I would suggest is to just like look over your two lists and just study like the contradictory messaging that you've received, which actually becomes a powerful living example of what Gregory Bateson referred to as the double bind. So you may already know of this concept. And he theorized this as an active cause of schizophrenia. It's fascinating reading, very explanatory, very insightful. And so many of these criticisms also come from people in socially conferred positions of power, in which they're basically just reinforcing the assignment of rules that uphold ideologies of meritocracy, which is one of the essential structures of the Matrix, and not uncoincidentally, perfectly feeds the needs of capitalist and neoliberal ideology. So, whether you're dealing with a narcissist dynamic in a personal or a professional setting, or even within a wider social structure, it involves the same oppression of expression and authenticity in favor of maintaining egoic and hierarchical and polarity based power structures. This is a quite common critique. You can see this in sociology and anthropology. Um, so, our best defense against all of this, while preserving our sensitivity and preserving our consciousness, that's the goal, right? We lose it all if we just, slip back into the matrix, which is complete unconsciousness. So, what we can do here is to develop a healthy core of self validating practices. And, these can really work like immune boosters that can help us be less affected by so many toxic forms of communication, violent forms of communication. And so, one of these strategies is that you can try to put yourself in a position where your well being isn't dependent on someone's arbitrary assignment of approval or disapproval and so on. And this isn't quite satisfying. Like, this feels more like a minimize your social grid footprint type of approach. Another approach could be to, again, note the degree of incoherence and inconsistency within the edicts of the matrix, basically, whatever matrix you participate in. And to note that most of these judgments and criticisms are coming from a completely unconscious place. Whether someone is merely parroting the standards of traditions of power, or if someone is unconsciously projecting their own negatively perceived qualities onto you, or treating you like their emotional garbage bin. These are just two strategies again, and they're definitely like incomplete. They feel insufficient on your own. So ultimately, we need to ground our self-validation in something even more like positive and life-affirming, into a framework that we can really extend to everyone for the benefit of the flourishing of all. So we don't have a sustainable collective sphere if a majority of humans feel like, we're living in the Hunger Games, or like cramped cages, like chickens pecking at each other, for like who gets the food first. So, this deeper topic of self validation is something that I'll be devoting myself to in an upcoming webinar, or it might be more of like a short course. And it's going to include like a lot of group discussion time where we can really like work through our own particular individual challenges with validation. And so I'll be posting updates about this on the community page here on YouTube, and I'll also have a link below again where you can like sign up directly for these. And again, in the meantime, I encourage you to dig in and to explore this further to get a sense of like which areas of your life are still places where you're really impacted by the real or perceived needs for certain forms of validation or approval from some kind of external source. And in some cases, depending on your job, of course, these things are mandatory depending on what you do, but speaking more within the personal sphere and within, your own personal space and what you feel you need for your own well-being. And, ultimately, most forms of criticism and judgment are toxic, and it's like swimming in toxic waters. So it doesn't really matter if you just turn your back on it if you're still in the same toxic water. And so what we need to do is like really remove ourselves from this fork of the game entirely. And that's all I've got for you at the moment. So let me know how this goes for you, and I'll see you in the comments.